Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I am Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are hosting a Praxis favorite, David Talbot. Talbot is an author, activist, and media entrepreneur who was the founder and editor of the early online web magazine Salon. He has recently launched the David Talbot Show, a blog which we will talk about today. And he has also just finished what he calls his last history book, By the Light of Burning Dreams, The Triumphs and Tragedies of the Second American Revolution, which is an examination of the flawed revolutionary heroes of the 1960s and 70s, and what we can learn from their lives today and the stories about them. His books include The Devil's Chessboard, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government, Brothers, The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years, Season of the Witch, about San Francisco politics, and Between Heaven and Hell, which is about his recovery from a stroke in 2017. We have read all these books in the Praxis Book Club, so we are familiar with you, David, and we love your work. I wanted to give the URL for the David Talbot Show. John, can you put that in the chat box? It's
Yep, got it.
www.thedavidtalbotshow.com. So welcome, David.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Let's bring your volume up just a little bit. Let's go on from here. So there you are.
Yeah, okay.
Great. Okay, I know everyone is very anxious to hear your take on the insurrection, the impeachment trial, and fascism in America. But first, I'd like you to tell us something about your blog, The David Talbot Show, why you started it, what you're hoping to do with it, and how we can all get involved.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me again today. I appreciate being here. Your audience is always such a great, intelligent sounding board for me, Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you.
The David Talbot blog was my escape plan from Mark Zuckerberg's plantation, Facebook, where I've labored for free for many years, like many of us in social media. And I just felt that as a professional journalist, I was spending too much time and on each one of my posts in Facebook. And that at some point, I just felt like I was, an unpaid laborer. And of course, we all know about the criticisms that have been leveled at Facebook and Twitter and the other social media giants, which became more and more severe, I think, during the Donald Trump presidency. So it all came together for me in January. I felt it was the right time. I've been threatening to do this for some time and set up my own blog, and I did. And I know a number of journalists, Matt Taibbi and others, have been doing their own thing through email newsletters. Heather Cox Richardson has had great success at that. I didn't want to try the newsletter. I think I've gotten enough mail in my junk mail account. So I just set up my blog, hung out my shingle, and those who want to come see what I have to say each day are free to do it. I ask for donations. It's completely free, though, if you can't afford any money right now. But as I say, there's no such thing as a free press in America. And I think we all have to get used to the idea, once again, the digital sort of corporate machine destroyed journalism in some ways, the business model for journalism. I think we have to get used to the idea of paying again for what we value.
I think that's a very good point. And we did put the URL in the chat box so you can get that. And we save the chat every week. So those of you who are on this call, you can save it yourselves. And if you don't know how to do that, I will send you the whole saved chat log, plus the recording if you want that as well. So I want to encourage you to go. I've been on the site, I've made my donation, and I want to encourage everyone to do that because I think what you're doing is really important, David, and I agree with you about Facebook is the plantation. We don't want to be the slaves on the plantation. So thank you for starting that. Now let's go to some current events because I know you probably have a lot of thoughts about the impeachment, the insurrection, what would you like to say first about the insurrection before we get to the impeachment, and what your thoughts have been about it, and if there's what the fallout might be from it or might not be, where we need to go from here with this?
Sure. Well, I think my thoughts probably correspond with a lot of your Praxis members. I watched in real time, as I'm sure many of you did, the events of January 6th with a mounting sense of horror. As Noam Chomsky later commented, here we have this huge military juggernaut that's supposed to defend American democracy. And where were they on the day when American democracy really was at stake on January 6th, as Congress attempted to complete the ceremonial, largely, process of electing a new president? So, I was wondering, why do we have such a thin blue line protecting Congress in this very vulnerable moment? And, after spending, as we all have, many tax dollars over the years to support this military juggernaut, where were they to defend American democracy? And I think people are still asking this now. And of course, as we've seen some of the video this week during the Democratic manager's presentation of their case, it's pretty horrifying how close we came actually to maybe losing some key members of Congress to the mob, if not Mike Pence himself, who of course many in the mob wanted to hang. So it was, I think, an alarming moment, and it shows again how fragile a vessel American democracy or any democracy is. And I've been having this argument with, or discussion with some younger people, including my sons the last week, who feel that a lot of the liberal media coverage has been overly hyped, and that now they're very fearful, as I am, of once again, like after 9/11, this crisis in American democracy being used to actually stifle future dissent on the left and the right. And of course, even with Biden, who I think is a fairly benign, president, and we can talk about this more later, there is still that threat, of course, of a crackdown on civil liberties under the guise of protecting democracy. So I'm concerned about that. But I do think that whatever you feel about the police at this point, after George Floyd and the defunding movement and so on, I think that you have to say that the fact that that thin blue line, first the Capitol Police, and secondly, the DC Metro Police held that day, and that we didn't lose members of Congress to this very vengeful and angry and violent, I think in many cases, mob, is a testament to the bravery of certain officers that day. And I have to find myself feeling sympathetic to the cop who said, thank you for saving my life, to those in the crowd who pulled him out of harm's way, but fuck you for being here. And to me, I think that was the right attitude to have about the insurrection that day.
Well, a couple of things came up when you brought up where were the cops, where were the police, and I think it was almost like a stand down because they didn't obviously have the kind of support they needed that day. When there was the sense, well, more than the sense, there was the information that there was going to be a demonstration that afternoon, and yet we did not get the protection for our legislators. I think before looking at this testimony at the trial and looking at the videos, that we didn't realize how close it came to both Pelosi and Pence being killed, actually, and probably other members of Congress and the Senate as well. It came much closer than I thought, and I think than a lot of people thought. And that is very frightening. And I'm wondering when you said that your sons are worried about the liberal media, have they watched this? Have they watched these videos? And have they changed their ideas about it since seeing them?
Yeah, I think, as I've been discussing this further, particularly with my older son, Joe, his feelings are complex. I don't want to stereotype what younger progressive, left-wing people are feeling, but there is obviously a very deep suspicion about police power in this country, not just among African American citizens, but among many progressive white people. And they were out in the street, of course, many of these young people after the horrendous George Floyd killing last year. And so there's an ongoing suspicion of police power and of venerating any cops, even the ones who did their duty that day on January 6th and stood their ground, I think very bravely, because they were obviously being overrun and they were outnumbered and they were being, in many cases, brutally treated by the mob. So I think, you know, I think young radicals have a complex view of what happened on January 6th and are rightfully concerned about being used, I think, to justify further crackdown on civil liberties and protest. You know, the fact is, that wasn't the first time the Capitol was assaulted. People keep saying, oh, well, it wasn't, we have to go back to 1812, the war with the British, to really see another historic parallel. But my generation also targeted the Capitol, not the same way. There wasn't a mob that overran the Capitol, but the Weather Underground put bombs to the Capitol. And there's definitely an effort during the New Left days that I write about in my new book to overthrow the government. And by any means necessary, as the saying went at the time. So, the young part of me, the militant part of me from those days did feel some even kind of weird symmetry with some of the, kind of anger, I think, of the protesters, even this time. I think it was misplaced. I think it's misdirected. I think their ideology is really deeply wrong and in some cases evil. But I think the sense that among many Trump supporters that they've been abandoned by power, by the elites in this country, is well-founded. And I think that the left and the liberals in this country do have to address that deep sort of frustration and anger that's out there. I mean, whether we like it or not, over 74 million people voted for Donald Trump in November. 74 million. That was the highest number of votes cast for anybody in American history except for Joe Biden. So that to me is alarming. And that to me sends a very deep message to the left that we can't take these people for granted. They're not going to disappear, obviously, even the most angry and extreme among them. And I think Joe Biden is off to a good start, I have to say. Again, as someone to the left of Biden, I voted for Bernie. I wanted Bernie to be our next president. But along with Bernie, I support a lot of what Biden's been doing the first month in office. And particularly when it goes to, I think, pushing for the $1.9 trillion relief bill. And under that, I think, or an extension of that, really addressing the economic, I think, disempowerment of regions like West Virginia and Appalachia, trying to retrain people in the fossil fuel economy, coal miners and so on, to become part of the new Green New Deal. I think these are essential. And if Biden cannot succeed at doing that, at doing essentially what Franklin Roosevelt during the 30s with the Tennessee Valley Authority and other major federal projects that put white Southerners to work. I think if you don't do that under Biden, we're going to have real trouble in this country in the next 2 to 4 years.
Well, that brings us to the Green New Deal again. And I think one thing that I've been very impressed with and surprised by is how Biden has actually reached out to the progressives in the party, AOC and Bernie and various people who Hillary and the groups before who were running for president did not reach out. In fact, they had somewhat of a disdain for that faction of the Democratic Party. So the fact that Biden has reached out to the more progressive wing and is actually listening and incorporating some of the things they're advocating, I think this bodes well. And especially now it looks like what you're talking about with the jobs. A Green New Deal is the way to create a lot of those jobs. And I just would like you to talk a little bit more about how you see the Green New Deal maybe helping with Biden's popularity and with reaching that group of people?
Well, coal mining, let's just take that because West Virginia voted, excuse me, in higher numbers for Donald Trump than any other state in the union. Nearly 70% of the state went for Trump, rather, I'm sorry, for Donald Trump. Uh, that to me is shocking because, of course, West Virginia being a poor state, a working state, person state, with a long history of labor militants. We remember, some of us, Harlan County, that film that was done by Barbara Koppel back in the, I think, 70s. Uh, you know, uh, Voted Democratic, that state, for many years, voted for Kennedy. Uh, and I think up until Bush really was seen as a Democratic stronghold. And the fact that West Virginia went so heavily for Trump, to me, was a wake-up call for all of us. Again, these are people who've been, I think, thrown to the side, given promises for years by both parties that haven't been delivered. Donald Trump obviously was basing his pitch to the coal mining industry with a lie that coal could be revived. Last year, I think there were more jobs generated for the first time by renewable energy sources than coal mining. And so it's obviously a dying industry, a dirty industry that should go away. It's a dangerous industry. And no family in West Virginia should want their sons to go down into those pits. My ancestors were Irish people. And there are two things that when they came to this country, they knew they had to avoid. One was going down into the pits, which they'd done in Ireland. And another was to give fealty to the Pope. So they declared their independence from both Rome and the mines. And I think that, people in West Virginia would dearly love that. If you could retrain them in the new economy, in the Green New Deal, to do solar jobs, to do jobs in renewable energy, wind and so on, geothermal, I think those should be good jobs, good union jobs that pay well. Then I can't see the people of West Virginia resisting that at all, and would welcome it, in fact. So I think that has to be a big part of Biden's appeal. He also, of course, wants to build the infrastructure of this country. I mean, you can't go out in the streets of America anymore and not see how it's decaying all around us: streets, bridges, freeways, and so on. So, the basic infrastructure of this country has to be rebuilt as well. Well, those, again, are thousands of jobs, and Joe Biden is right to be pitching his effort to revive America basically as a jobs program. Is what it is. It's going to retrain and put thousands and thousands of people to work doing good jobs.
I think that's exactly when you're pointing to the Tennessee Valley Authority of FDR. This would be the Green New Deal is a very similar type of thing. It would create jobs in a very similar way. So, and I think we're headed that way. I don't think when FDR was elected, people realized what he was going to do, and I think the same thing is happening now. I think we're being surprised by what Biden is doing, and
Yeah, George, look, I'm still, I think of myself as a journalist of the left, stalwart of the left. I have been my whole life, and will die, a strong member of the left. But I have to say that a lot of criticism of Biden from the left is, to me, infantile. I mean, I read all these publications, and I read Jacobin, for instance, magazine, and Jacobin's in its new issue is calling Biden the third term of Barack Obama. That's not true. It's just historically and politically inaccurate. It's clear, as Paul Krugman writes today, the columnist for the New York Times, that Biden has learned from the mistakes of Obama and is going further than Obama in his economic revival. He's not going for piecemeal kind of reforms as Obama did. He's not trying to he's not getting bogged down in negotiations with Republicans. He's saying, here's what the country needs. Here's the bare minimum we need, and take it or leave it. And he knows that he has a bare majority in the Senate to push through his relief plan under the sort of hardball reconciliation, as it's called, a misnomer, reconciliation. But in any case, he's doing the right thing. I did not think that bipartisan Biden would do that. I
Right.
thought he was going to be more, sort of cautious and more like Obama, but he's not. He's going for it more forcefully. And he knows that he has to, I think, because if he doesn't, then we're going to reap the wind. Well, because I think if Biden fails, his administration fails, then all bets are off. I think what we saw on January 6th could be just a harbinger of what we see in even bigger terms in the future. And at some point, that crazy right, the extreme right, is going to produce someone, a leader much more intelligent and shrewd than Donald Trump. And then I think this country is looking truly at a fascist future. Uh, and so that's why it's so important for Biden to succeed. And I think it's important for the coalition to hold together. And that's why I also applaud Bernie Sanders, who could have been bitter still, about his defeat by Biden. Biden said, hey, the socialists didn't win. You could see him gloating in a way over that defeat. But Bernie Sanders, to his credit, is saying no, that the progressives are being treated as part of Biden's coalition. And he's a friend, and I'm going to work with him. And I think that's the way to get things done, to push for our progressive agenda, is to work within the Biden presidency. And look, that doesn't mean we don't criticize it sometimes or yell and scream and push from the outside and mobilize people and even go in the street sometimes. But the fact is, I think Biden knows how important the left wing of the party is to his success. And I think we have to act like grown-ups now instead of outside agitators.
I think that's a really good point. There's so many things I want to ask you, but I'm going to let the audience ask some of the questions I'm thinking of because I want to get to your book now and talk to you about by the light of the burning dreams, the triumphs and tragedies of the Second American Revolution. Tell us about what that book is about and some of the people that you highlight in the book and why.
Well, that book began before my stroke. I began working on that book back in 2016. And Trump had not yet been elected. It was a very different country, but a country where we saw the dark clouds were forming already. And I'd written about dark power in America, the devil's chessboard. And in some ways, I put everything I knew and had learned about dark power, unelected power, the deep state, as some call it, uh, in that book. And I did in the guise of a biography of Alan Dulles, who was, I think, sort of the dark wizard of American politics in the 20th century. And the clearest kind of analogy to him, or the closest analogy in sort of this century, would be Dick Cheney. But he was kind of Dick Cheney on steroids. And of course, he became head of the CIA when his brother was running the State Department, John Foster Dulles. And they were really a 1-2 punch that we've never quite seen in American politics, because a lot of the work was done behind the scenes in a very veiled and in a kind of undemocratic or anti-democratic way. So with this new book, I felt that, like Season Witch, I wanted to give people a little more hope. I wanted to say, here's the movements during my lifetime that came the closest to changing America, to pushing America forward against all odds. And in some ways, trying to, as I say, it was the Second American Revolution, to revive the ideals of the original American Revolution and say that many Americans had been left out of those dreams, those earlier dreams, as Martin Luther King and others had said. So I wanted to talk about the heroes of the Second American Revolution, the people that I grew up with, in some cases knew personally, as I know you did, Georgia, Tom Hayden and others, Bobby Seale of the Black Panthers, and go back to them in cases where I could, interview them again, or in other cases, just interview their friends, their colleagues, people who had worked with them if they had passed on, and come to some kind of understanding, deeper understanding of what we accomplished in the Second American Revolution and what we failed to accomplish. And in what sense were these leaders heroic and made the right decisions at the right times? And in what sense do they make fatal mistakes that we need to learn from today? So we looked at, in 7 chapters, my sister, Margaret Talbot, who's a writer for The New Yorker. Some of you may know her work. I was honored and fortunate to be able to work with Margaret on this book. We did it together. She did some chapters, I did others. And we looked at more than 7, because in some chapters there were like 3 or 4 heroes in one chapter. But again, looking at them at pivotal moments in their lives, decisions they'd made that had important impacts on their own life and changed the course of American history.
So do you want to pull out one of those persons before we go to questions and just tell us something about the person and what you, maybe Tom Hayden would be a good example of the success and the mistakes.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Tom, and someone that I know you knew and I knew. And I love Tom, warts and all. I thought he was the most interesting intellectual figure on the New Left. Of course, from his Port Huron statement days on, he was the main writer, as Thomas Jefferson was, of the Declaration of Independence. Tom was the Port Huron statement, which was really the statement by the young people in the early 60s that defined the New Left at that moment, and what the sort of vision was for the New Left. I thought Tom, what I do in that chapter is I talk about Tom in the Red family, which was the commune that he kind of dominated with his personality and his fame in Berkeley in the early 70s. He was very deeply involved with a woman named Ann Wiles, who was another kind of alpha figure within that commune. And they had a falling out. It became a larger political falling out. And Tom was exiled, not only from the Red family, which was his family and his base, but really from Berkeley as a whole, and from the New Left, which had been his family for years throughout the 60s. And suddenly he found himself adrift and alone. He had a nervous breakdown. He moved to Los Angeles. But slowly Tom rebuilt himself, and he realized that he did not just want to be an exile or a bitter sort of loner, that he had something to offer American political life. And so instead, what he did was to go right back into the political mainstream, which is what Tom originally did back in the early 60s, before the New Left, before the Vietnam movement, before the elders, the crisis of the elders, as Tom put it, had driven so many young people out of politics or to the radical extremes. But Tom said, no, I'm going to take my New Left ideals and go back into the political mainstream. And he did this, of course, in partnership with Jane Fonda, the woman he later married and his political partner throughout this period. And he ran for US Senate, which was a pretty ballsy thing to do for a New Left figure who only a few years before had been on trial in Chicago on federal charges of inciting to riot, and could have been in jail at that moment. Instead, he was running for Senate. And he was running for Senate using a lot of the same radical slogans and radical issues that he had championed throughout the 60s. And I thought that was the way that the New Left should have gone. I think the New Left, like Bernie Sanders, like Tom Hayden, like Bobby Seale, who ran for mayor of Oakland in 1973, should have gone the electoral path much more strongly than it did. And it took decades for the left to finally learn that lesson. Hayden, instead of, I interviewed Bill Zimmerman, who's a great guy who was the campaign manager for Tom Hayden, another New Left figure who had run, sort of helped organize the May Day demonstrations, the very, militant demonstrations against Nixon in the Vietnam War in DC. He had sort of committed treason by passing penicillin, the latest form of penicillin that didn't need to be refrigerated, to the North Vietnamese, that allowed them to be more effective as fighters on the battlefield in Vietnam. So, he also flew an airplane over Wounded Knee during the siege there of the Indians who took over that outpost and the reservation in South Dakota, and he dropped supplies to the Native Americans, including Dennis Banks and the American Indian movement there. So Bill Zimmerman's an amazing figure too. He's kind of like a zealot of the left, and he's still alive. And I interviewed Bill, and he said, "Look, we were going to take our stand with the U.S. Senate run in 1976, and felt that like we could contend for power." And that's what I think it took years for the American left to realize, to learn that we should be in the mainstream. We should be fighting for ideas and our values in the mainstream in American politics. Instead, Hayden was ridiculed later by many on the left, said, oh, you did it because you have a celebrity wife, Jane Fonda. We couldn't, emulate this anywhere else. And that was the wrong lesson to take from what his losing campaign, because he lost, of course, in the Democratic primary to John Tunney. But it was a noble loss, defeat, and he went on to keep at it in electoral politics. And he later served for many years in the California state legislature, doing whatever he could, even though mostly he was up against Republican governors during that time. So I respect Tom for doing the hard work of politics his whole life, never giving up. I think that the left finally learned that lesson in recent years with the Bernie Sanders campaign, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez campaign in New York, and many others now who are realizing if you really are serious about power, you can't just scream on the sidelines. You have to go into the electoral mainstream.
That's very well put, David. And it's one of the things that Tom Hayden has said at a couple of our conferences was that the left often, or whatever is outside the mainstream, will eventually come into the mainstream if you bring it in. And I think what Tom trailblazed on this, he was, I think, one of the first, at least of our generation, who realized we've got to get into electoral politics. And he was in the California State Assembly and then the California State Senate. And I think did some incredible work while he was in those bodies that wouldn't have happened without him. And granted, he was up against Republican governors, but I think it showed the way. And I think what you're saying is really right on. So now I want to open it up to questions from our audience. And when you're called on, you can unmute yourself. I'm looking for people who might want to be asking questions. They're just dumbfounded right now. You've silenced them.
Linda has a question,
Okay,
or Rocky.
Linda, go ahead.
Rocky. Yes, David, just an opinion. Several military vets have asked me, why didn't the police on the 6th of Jan fall back to the top of the stairs and make a defense of the Capitol?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, we saw some of them just, give in and and sort of step back and allow the crowd to pour into the Capitol building, but not all of them. And so, I was deeply dismayed to see those police officers through either cowardice or maybe even sympathy with some of the protesters, because we know that some of the ideology of the pro-Trump and white nationalist ideology is shared by some, unfortunately, in the military and the police departments across the country. And I think that's true also of the Capitol Police. But the guy, I have to say, I'm sort of an optimist about this. And the guy I keep thinking of is Brian Sicknick, the guy who died, the guy who was smashed in the head and finally died from his injuries. He was a Trump supporter. He was a military veteran. He was a conservative by all accounts. And yet he stood his ground and he fought as hard as he could to keep that crowd away and out of the Capitol building, which he was defending with his life. So that guy gave his life that day. And I think many other officers also acted bravely. And they were outnumbered. They're grossly outnumbered. That was the bigger question, I think. Where were the reinforcements? It took a long time for the Capitol Police to finally come. Thank God they finally came. And many of them acted heroically too and were injured. But where was the military? Where was the National Guard? Those questions, I think, still have to be deeply investigated. We've heard some of the answers, that Trump had replaced many people at the Pentagon. So the decision to let the National Guard come that day was held up, and so on and so forth. But, as George had said earlier, we had warnings. People knew about this for days and days before it happened. So where was the kind of military presence we had during the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, where they were much more out in force, the military and the police, than they were that day on January 6th, when they had full warning. So I don't think we've fully understood this. I think, though, your larger question is about the loyalty within the ranks in the police and the military, and that to me is the most alarming thing. because I do think that there's obviously a faction, and maybe it's a growing faction within our military even, that is pro-Trump, white nationalist, extremist in its views. We've seen this at different times throughout American history. During the period I studied Kennedy, when Kennedy was president, you had Edwin Walker, you remember Walker, who was also a traitor and was handing out John Bircher literature to his troops in West Germany, and was finally driven out of the military by JFK. But then he showed up in Mississippi during a riot there, where they're trying to hang the first African-American student to integrate Ole Miss. And he was whipping up a mob there too. So January 6th was ugly and frightening, but it was not the first example we have of this, where there's an angry right-wing mob that's being incited often by people who are in positions of authority. And, you know, the military held this time, thank God. The police held this time. It was a thin line, but they held. But I think what Jamie Raskin and others in Congress are asking now is, will this be true the next time it happens? And, you know, as long as there's a Donald Trump, you know, and that kind of political figure out there inciting this kind of violence, then you have to worry.
Ben, I see Ben, do you want to ask your question?
Then George.
Yes, I like your discussion about the movement from protest to electoral politics, because this debate is still very much live on the left. Even now, there's like a kind of I call them the dum-dum left, part of the anarchist left, who are essentially anti-authoritarian. They're whoever's in power, they're against them, essentially, is their political stance. But they have, unfortunately, because we do not have a left political formation that's really coherent in this country. They have a lot of adherents because they'll have, they have major YouTube shows, people like Jimmy Dore, whatever, who are going after the few elected progressives. Because for them, the very participation in electoral politics means you've sold out. And I think that it's important for those of us on the left who do actually want to take state power instead of be a protest movement, to start making this clear that these people are not part of our coalition. They're representing a irrelevant fragment.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I'm, as a, as a grown-up radical, again, who talks to my sons who are both in their 20s about this, who feel as passionately as I did back in those days, about challenging power, questioning authority, and so on. I do emotionally sympathize with a lot of these protesters who continue, as you say, to tear down Biden or anyone in a position of authority. But identifying with them emotionally is different than, siding with them politically or intellectually. And I do think we have to forcefully argue for the position that now we are close to power. We have the ability, we have an organized movement behind us. We have certainly members of Congress who are on our side to push for the kind of agenda, the ideas, the positions, the policies that we want. And it, I think, would be infantile and ridiculous of people on the left, like those Jacobin magazine or, any other left-wing magazine that's saying this at this point, to write off the Biden administration. Sure, look, the Julian Assange thing gets my blood boiling. They're going after the Biden Department of Justice, Assange again. They're trying to get him extradited again. They're trying to get the British to throw away the ruling that they just made, saying he shouldn't be extradited because his life is in danger in U.S. presence. So to me, there's a kind of a knee-jerk sort of military-industrial national security kind of reflex in any administration, and it's certainly there within the Biden administration too. And I'm much more concerned about the Biden administration when it comes to foreign policy and its national security sort of policies than I am about its domestic policies. So we have to be very vigilant there and push back. But he did the right thing in Yemen. Which Bernie Sanders was pushing for, cutting off military aid to Saudi Arabia and their horrendous war in Yemen, genocidal war. So even on foreign policy things and military things, I don't think, Biden is just a continuation of the military industrial past. I think he's open to pressure. And that is, in the real world, politically, is the best you can do. We're not going to have a revolution anytime soon, at least not from the left. We almost had one from the right. But from the left, what we can now say is that we fought and won a very difficult presidential election that was a real nail biter. And frankly, American democracy was on the line then. And it was on the line up until January 6th, up until Biden was inaugurated. And that's what I try and get young leftists to appreciate. That democracy may not be perfect, it may not be exactly what you want, but it is a fragile and really hallowed institution that has to be fought for again and again and again. And the only way to really do that is to go into the political mainstream, talk to your fellow Americans, argue with them, debate with them, persuade them, and try to win these elections. Because in democracy, that's where the rubber hits the road. And it's on election day when you see whether you won or not. Now, Stacey Abrams, I think in Georgia, has to be considered an American hero because of what she did. Imagine what if she had not done what she did. If she had gone home and just, licked her wounds after she was robbed of her victory in her campaign for governor. She could have done that, but she didn't. She went out and organized people day in and day out for days. And it paid off with these two amazing Senate elections in Georgia. And it was only because of those Senate elections that Biden has any chance now of getting his agenda through Congress. And thank God she did what she did. So that to me is like the real sort of nitty gritty of American democracy and American politics. And I don't want to hear at this point from people screaming in the streets as much as I want to hear from people who say, you know what, we're inside now. We're inside that building. The mob is outside the building. We're inside the building and we're trying to get our legislative agenda through. That's where the action should be right now.
Really good points. I think when we were talking about Jacobin Magazine and some of these other leftists who are already critical of Biden, one of the things we've been reading in one of the books we've had for our book club is the problem people have with complexity. So it's very easy to take a position and then stay with that position no matter what information might interfere with it, than it is to constantly be re-looking at something because of the complexity of issues that intersect. That takes maturity, emotional maturity, not just intellectual, but it takes a level of emotional maturity that maybe a lot of people don't have, no matter what their age. So I think we're up against the inability of people to hold different ideas in their minds, complexity of issues, and then work through those. So that's something I've been thinking about a lot too.
Yeah, that's funny, Georgia, because actually the title of my chapter about Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda and the Red family in my upcoming book is the purity of protest and the complexity of politics. And I think that's exactly sort of, the apt description for what many on the left have to grapple with. At what point do you go beyond the purity of protest and say, I'm now in the halls of power? And that always involves some compromise, always involves some complexity. And you're going to go home at the end of the day not feeling like, you've won the revolution, but hopefully you've won incrementally, something that will change the lives for the better of many Americans.
Right. Thank you. Fran Corton, you're next.
Actually, I think Julie had her hand up. She just didn't raise it via the
Okay,
hand
Julie,
feature.
Fran,
So we couldn't.
and then John.
Yeah, Julie and then Fran.
Okay, Julie.
Anybody knew the number of protesters, rioters that stormed stormed the Capitol on January 6th, it looked like a lot of people to me. And if you're planning a wedding or whatever and have that many people show up, somebody had to do some advanced planning, transportation, everything. Just curious.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that it wasn't just a spontaneous eruption. I think it'd been, there's been a lot of reporting about this in the last few days and weeks, that there was real organization that went into that insurrection, that on talk radio, on social media, people were being organized. The Proud Boys and other organizations were mobilizing their people, and they were just ready for Trump to light the match that day, which he did, of course. And I think it was all in coordination. I think it was all planned ahead of time. And there was nothing really spontaneous about it. There might have been some people in that mob who actually went down there into the heat of the moment. But the people leading it, the people with the Ziplocs who were inside actually the Capitol chambers and looking for members of Congress to kidnap and God knows do what with. They had Ziplocs, they had weapons, they come prepared. So that wasn't a spontaneous eruption. I agree with you. That was something that was very carefully planned.
Okay, thank you. Fran, you're next.
Yeah, thank you. So I was a real fan of Barack Obama and supported so much of what he did. But the place that he disappointed me the most was on trade policy and this pushing of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I'm wondering, David, if you have any initial take on where Biden is on that topic.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Obama, you couldn't hope for a more charismatic, eloquent, kind of progressive leader in many ways. I agree with you. But a lot of it, I think, was on the surface with Obama. And I felt that he was bottlenecked by the Republican opposition, which was, obviously just wanted to stymie him in every possible way. But I think being the first African-American president, he was maybe loath to go above that bottleneck and appeal directly to the American people and to do the kind of soapbox politics that he needed to do. I think Joe Biden is different. He's been in the halls of power much longer. I think the times are more urgent now. I think he has deeper connections to the labor movement. So I don't think he's going to be selling out, basically, working people as much as Barack Obama was with some of these international trade deals. He's already signaled that he's going to pull back from some of those overseas deals that he does feel sell out working people in the US. So I expect that Biden will not be, as Jacobin Magazine is saying, will not be Barack Obama 3. And even if you're a supporter or you're still fond of Barack Obama, and I have some lingering fondness for him as well, although I criticized him heavily from the left often, you still have to feel that Biden is going to be an improvement over what Barack Obama, his legacy. From healthcare to trade deals to the environment, just about, I think, on every issue. Because, and if he's not, as I say, I think that we're in deep trouble. He has to deliver on those issues because they're much more urgent now after 4 years of Donald Trump and after a pandemic and after the further deterioration of the planet. Unless he succeeds on all those fronts, we're in deep trouble.
All right. John, I think you are next.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I guess, your thoughts on the paradox of tolerance and how we deal with an intolerant party in a two-party system, whose entire mantra is screw over everyone that isn't us. And in general, do you think the moderates and or apathetic voting populace is more of a problem than the radical right? I mean, Martin Luther King talks a lot about moderates who just want stability over upheaval. even though they quote unquote may believe in these socialist ideals or whatnot. Your thoughts on those two.
Well, Martin Luther King said that the white moderates who kept pushing for law and order were a bigger problem than the Ku Klux Klan. So he had no great sympathy for these so-called moderates at all. And of course, after his famous speech at Riverside Church in the year before he died, exactly a year before he was assassinated, the speech was in April 1967, where he tried to bring together the peace movement with the civil rights movement and the anti-poverty movement. I think Martin Luther King was a very radical figure, more radical than we appreciate or understand today. And I think that's why he was killed. But yes, I think Joe Biden is already doing the right thing. He and his spokesperson at the White House have already signaled that he's not about to try to unify Capitol Hill. He's not trying to unify Congress. He knows he can't. He's trying to unify the American people. And I think that's an important distinction to make. What he said is, I think, right on the mark. Look, Congress is hopelessly deadlocked. It's a 50-50 breakdown in the Senate. And you just have to hope that you can bring Joe Manchin, who's basically a Republican, the Democrat supposedly from West Virginia, over to your side. And I think, they've got his commitment on the 1.9 trillion relief bill because he knows that the people of West Virginia are really hurting and they need that money. So, but who knows about other issues? You hear that Joe Manchin's already pushing for Biden to go back on his promise to withdraw support for the Keystone Pipeline because he's a fossil fuel guy. So, look, it's going to be a case by case, fight by fight on Capitol Hill. But what Biden can do, and I think he should do this even more aggressively, is to say, look, the American people are on my side. Republicans are on my side. A majority of Republicans back his 1.9 trillion relief bill, even if the Republican senators don't. And I think the extent to which you can drive a wedge between the Republican base, the Republican voters, and the Republican officials in Washington will be the degree to which he succeeds as president.
Great points. Brian, you're next.
David, thanks for being here today. And I'm looking forward to your new book in a couple of months. And my question is, given the fact that it doesn't appear or look like Trump is going to be convicted for all his egregious lies and crimes in the Senate, what do you recommend for us to do?
Well, as I wrote today, it was a little bit facetious, but not really. I wrote on my blog today that I think the Republicans, based on this, the fact that they're not going to convict Donald Trump of crimes after he basically called for the head of his own vice president and the mob took him seriously and had a noose prepared to hang Mike Pence outside. Mike Pence, the spear carry for the president, you couldn't look for a more loyal guy, lapdog of the president. And that was the guy they were going after that day, along with Nancy Pelosi, of course, and AOC and other members of Congress. They would have loved to, God knows what, probably assassinate. So look, if the Republican Party, even when its own institution, its own building is under attack by a mob, can't convict Donald Trump of incitement, then you have to write off the Republican Party of today, of 2021, as a domestic terrorist organization. It's a cult. It's a cult based around Donald Trump, who's a dangerous, dangerous political figure. And so I don't think, and that's what I was saying earlier, that Joe Biden can expect to get any concessions from the Republican Party. Not Lisa Murkowski, not Susan Collins, maybe Mitt Romney, here and there, you can peel off. But, and you're trying to keep your own guy like Joe Manchin on board for the Democrats. So it's going to be really kind of like, just clawing away at each sort of legislative initiative and you hope you can get it through the Senate. But under Mitch McConnell, under, Ted Cruz, under what's his name from Missouri, Josh Hawley, these are extremists. I mean, Mitch McConnell is a cynical, I think, apparatchik, but the others are really dangerous extremists, Hawley and Cruz and those types. And you can't have anything to do with a party that is that whacked out It's a whacked out extremist party, and it's not even connected to its base anymore, or it's only connected to the most extreme part of its base. So I think what you have to do is exactly what Biden's doing. Go above them, appeal directly to the country, say what I'm doing is smart, it's rational, it's humane, and it's the only way to go if you care about your children and your grandchildren and keeping this country together. And I think that Biden is off to a good start that way.
It just reminded me when you said that maybe Biden could institute something like the FDR fireside chats to speak directly to the people through the media. Well,
that's unfortunately my only sort of qualm about Joe is that I think he's a great genial figure in many ways. You know, even though I voted for Bernie, I think he's the figure that we needed today to unify the country, and probably the only figure who could have won. Actually, he could have beaten Donald Trump. And that, I'd say, is the most depressing thing. After 4 years of Donald Trump, the American people knew everything they needed to know about him. And still 74 million people voted for him. And he almost won. It came down to a few states. But anyway, I think my only qualm with old Joe is that he is no FDR. He's no Barack Obama. He's no Jack Kennedy. And, you know, he lacks that, I think, charismatic sort of quality and the ability to, you know, to win people over through the eloquence of his words. But, you know, look, on the other hand, he's I think, a decent, thoroughly decent man. And I think that comes across in his communication with the public. So he stutters, he stumbles, he's not particularly eloquent. We all know that. But there's something about him that I think the American people trust. And I think he might very well, I hope to God, he is the president that the country needs right now. Right. Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions and then we're going to finish. So Mike, you're next.
Oh, geez, thanks. Well, I'll try to just be brief if I can. You know, I don't know what to expect in the future or what's going to happen. I can't believe some of the things I've seen this year and heard. I do think he lit the match. I don't think any of that would have happened without him. And I firmly believe in all that. But I wonder, you know, we keep saying 74 million people voted, 74 million people. And just if things had been a little different in timing, and I was mentioning this to my brother the other day, I wonder if this insurrection had happened, okay, like, well, I know the timing's not right, but say in July or June or July or August, I wonder if 74 million really would have voted for him. I have a feeling that number would have been a lot less. But anyway, that's one thing. The other thing is, nobody's ever seen anything like what happened on the 6th. I do believe it was expected and they could have prevented it very easily. And I say very, very easily because look what happened on inauguration. 25,000 National Guard. Nothing happened. Everything was smooth. If there had been 25,000 or 20,000 or 15,000 or 10 that day, that wouldn't have happened. I don't believe that would have happened. And also, I couldn't believe how close they all came. There could have been 20, 50 or more congressmen murdered very, very easily. And I can't believe that knowing that these guys and gals, they're all still going the same way they're going, knowing they literally could have been murdered that day. And yet they're holding on to that power base as much as they possibly can. So I don't think there's going to be another Trump is what I'm trying to say. People say, well, what's going to happen in the future? I'd like to know what your thoughts are. I mean, what kind of, let's say, violence? I mean, we're prepared for this now. Honestly, I never realized that this ceremonial thing was important as it was, that day would be would cause such chaos. I never even paid any attention to that day in the past. I don't know about everybody else, but I just didn't realize that was the day that you can overthrow the government or try. Not that they had a plan. So anyway, now I'm kind of babbling, but thanks for letting me speak. And I just was wondering what kind of, as far as violence goes, I think we're really keyed into that now. I mean, there's been one Donald Trump in 200 years, so it's not like this happens every 4 years. This is an incredibly unusual thing. And I mean, I certainly hope it's not the future going forward. But anyway, thanks.
Well, let me just jump on one of your points. Could we have another Donald Trump? Could Donald Trump have a future politically in this country? I mean, that's what Jamie Raskin and the other House managers who were trying to warn Congress that, look, unless we indict him, unless we convict him, he could very well, be running for president again. And certainly the Republican Party seems to be still in his thrall, and that's alarming. But look, I don't think, given his age and given how much damage he's taken politically now, I think that I agree with you that the riots really did hurt him politically. And the New York Times reported earlier this week that there's been a lot of people leaving the Republican Party throughout the country, particularly in California, but in other states as well. So yeah, I think that the vote would probably not be 74 million today. And my son, I think, agrees with you that Donald Trump is such an unusual figure and once in a 200-year figure that there can't be another one. I see history differently, though. And I think that Donald Trump himself came out of nowhere. Who would have believed, 5 years ago, even 6 years ago, that a reality TV guy, a failed businessman, someone who's a complete phony, a carny barker, could have been elevated to the president of the United States and build a movement around him. So it's the movement that I'm most concerned about, and the sort of widespread grievance among white working people that found its sort of outlet in Donald Trump. That's what I'm worried about. I'm reading a book now that I want to highly recommend. I push my own books, which you all should read, but also there's a fantastic book now called The Rat Line, by an international lawyer and a writer named Philippe Sands, like, beach on the beach, Sands. It's an amazing story of a guy that I'd never heard of, and I'd studied this history of Germany during the fascist period, Otto Wachter, who turns out to be a high-level SS guy underneath Hans Frank in sort of Middle Europe, and was responsible for rounding up hundreds of thousands of Jews and deporting them to their deaths in the death camps. Hans Frank, his boss, was convicted and hung at Nuremberg, as he should have been. But Otto Wachter was one of the guys who escaped through the notorious rat lines from Germany over the Alps into Italy, and lived for several more years in Italy. And this guy, Philippe Sands, who writes this book, many members of his family their lives were terminated, were destroyed by the Holocaust. And so he had a particular reason to want to know more about him. And it's his journey into the history of this family, the Wachter family. Otto, his wife Charlotte, who was an ardent Nazi as well, his sons and daughter, and he meets one of his sons, his youngest son, Horst, who still believes in the dad's mythology years later. This is now 2014, 15, 16, that he is talking to Horst in his castle outside Vienna. And, seeing that there's still this mythology around the Fuhrer, around his father, that people cannot let go of. So this is my long-winded way of saying that whatever produced Donald Trump, the conditions that produced Donald Trump, the movement that gathered around him is still there. And so no matter if Donald Trump has a future or not, someone else is going to mobilize that movement, that base, unless Joe Biden, as I said, succeeds in peeling off a significant percentage of those people. And I think he is off to the right start. I think he could do it, and we all have to pray and work to make sure that he does succeed, because I think that if it's not Donald Trump, someone else will emerge to lead this movement. We couldn't see Donald Trump coming 5-6 years ago. We can't see who might be coming 5 or 6 years from now, but someone will. Someone will exploit it politically. And like in Germany, it could be someone much more shrewd.
Smarter. So I think maybe this will be our last question from Ray.
Yes, a couple of things have come up in there. I mean, Trump has been threatening to run for president since basically '88. So he's been kind of dancing in that realm. Everybody's brushed it off as just his own ego, but his political rants, the Central Park Five, that sort of thing, have been, ongoing since that time. And now we learn that he's been being cultivated by Russia in one form or another, especially economically, for like the last 40 years. So we have that. Now the Republicans themselves, they've got a a problem of the social political base, the guns, God, and gays Trump people, um, as the shock troops, but they've also got the more important economic base, which is the corporations and the oligarchs. And so they're just trying to sort out that dynamic now. But my guess is that the oligarchs very much, want the shock troops on their side. So just like they've been cultivating for years, oh, you got to go out and fight for abortion when what we really want is, economic autonomy to do anything we want to you. So I think this whole thing was planned, that there was a strategic assault, in the planning, that they were after the line of succession. They went after Pence, which was a bit of a surprise, and Pelosi. And the next one after them would have been Chuck Grassley at the time, right, in the line of succession. So my guess is that there was a strategic plan. There's been some discussion about whether or not there were more skilled, targeted troops in this mob that were tasked for that. That's being looked into. So we have the planning. The managers talked about that there was a permit sought for a march, which was denied, and then everybody knew that, and so the planners themselves were surprised that suddenly, Trump and company is authorizing this, but they authorized that on January 5th.
I think you've got some noise, Ray. I'm going to ask you to
Yeah, I'm framing the question. So we've gone through all of that, and we still don't know when, like, the National Guard was requested, or who did the final authorization, because Trump wasn't into it. So how does all this, is there an analysis that you can frame around this set of issues? Clearly the Senate's not going to deal with it, so hopefully some legal proceeding will get it. But I really think this has to be out there so that the country has a basis of truth to move forward. Otherwise we're just going to be playing into Trump's hands.
Right. Well, you've raised a lot of questions, and it's a difficult thing to unwind all this. But let me just say that I think it's an ongoing threat. I agree with you. It could have been much more. It seems now like it was much more organized January 6th than we originally thought. Originally thought it was a bunch of lunatics with Viking helmets and so on in the rotunda, and obviously it was now more dire situation than that, and more organized. So look, this could be some people. I've seen this analogy, and not to dwell overly on the German history, but it could have been the Munich beer hall putsch, which was what, 1923, years before Hitler actually took power, almost a decade before. And of course he was rounded up, and it was seen as a comic sort of opera, flop at the time, and so on. But I think we now see that as the harbinger of Hitler's rise and his movement coalescing around him. So I think sort of the white nationalist sound and fury very seriously, and I think they're much more organized than we on the left are. They're certainly much better armed than we are. We now know that they undergo regular arms training, many of them. They're militias. They go overseas to get even further training in countries like Ukraine. It's actually globally organized, a lot of this right-wing, white nationalist extremism in Europe and the US, so and Russia. So I don't think we should now think, breathe a sigh of relief and go home like we did when Barack Obama got elected. I think that was a fatal error. I think liberals, young activists, we all sort of said, well, we got this African-American guy elected. He's the first guy, it's great. America's terrific, And little do we know that all during the Obama years, this festering poison was growing in the country. And, people like Mitch McConnell blocking Obama politically in Washington. So we can't have that anymore. We have to push our agenda forcefully through in Washington. We have to actually give people the kind of economic relief they desperately need and see this coming from the Democrats, not the Republicans. And, that's one thing I think we really have to expose even more is what complete phony and the charlatan that Trump was, that he promised all things from drawing down the US military overseas, bringing the troops home, economically empowering people, giving coal miners, sort of a new lease on life. It was all bullshit. It was all lies. And the Democrats now have an opportunity to come through in a way that Trump failed to do. He only helped his rich friends, his cronies. That's all he cared about. And I think you're right. The oligarchs were behind him. They got what they wanted. The tax bill, the huge tax, a break that they got under McConnell. And they got all the right-wing judges they wanted through McConnell and Trump. So the Democrats now have to come back and really take care of the American people, the working people. And I think if Biden succeeds, then we all succeed. The center holds. And, it's not going to be the Antifa people who save our asses on the streets. We tried that. The left tried that in Germany in the 20s and 30s, the street fighting with the brown shirts and Hitler's thugs. And Hitler's thugs won. So we need more than street fighting. We need to actually shore up the center, shore up civil society, shore up the Democratic Party, shore up the Congress, and get some real relief and some progressive legislation passed.
Very well put. This has been really exciting and very inspiring to hear you, David, and to get your thoughts on all this. I know we had a few people who wanted to still ask questions, but I think we need to give you a rest and just really appreciate you. And you can unmute yourselves if you want to applaud our wonderful speaker today. And I want to just thank you again so much, David.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
That was awesome, David. Loved being with you today.
Thank you
You're
so
the
much.
best, David.
Thanks for your blog.
Hey,
Thank you for your hard work.
thank you. It's
Just-
great to be here with you all.
Just
Looking
amazing.
forward to your new book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, and if you want an early copy of my new book, come on the David Talbot blog, the David Talbot Show tomorrow, and I'm going to be offering it for free if you sign up with my blog.
Oh, Valentine's gift.
Yeah.
Valentine's gift. Yes, love
Good,
it.
good incentive. And of course, we want you back, David, when the book comes out.
Of course. I'd love to.
Absolutely.
Great,
Thank you, everybody.
great.
Have a good
Thank you,
weekend.
David.
Thanks for your good
Okay,
work,
stay
David.
safe.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Awesome.
Bye.
Take care. So a new movie is just breaking out called Judas and the Black Messiah, the story of Fred Hampton being shot.